So, you know, there are moments where you think to yourself, what would be the political equivalent of the Rolling Stones meeting the Beatles? And that would surely be Pravin Gordhan and Jacques Poe. I mean, anyone managed to get a selfie with both of them? So, if you had to try and find out what the dividing line in the ANC is, what is it that divides the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 camps? If you wanted to know where someone stands in the ANC, you simply have to ask them this question. Was President Jacob Zuma right to fire Pravin Gordhan? I imagine there are one or two views on that here. And that's because what happened to Pravin Gordhan at midnight on March the 30th is the dividing line in the history of the ANC. It's the line that marked the change from the different factions trying to live with each other and then actually just giving up, and the sort of, I would say, open political discourse, you could say warfare if you like, that we're seeing at the moment. And the reason for this is the high esteem in which Pravin Gordhan is held, for the fact that he's come to symbolize a kind of public probity, a fight back against state capture. He's someone, I think probably 90% of people in this room believe, did his best to make sure that government money was not wasted. And then, when he was removed, he didn't go and sulk, he didn't get mad, he did something far more fun. He managed to get Brian Molefe and Lynn Brown under oath and ask them questions. And who wouldn't want that job? So, ladies and gentlemen, may I present Pravin Gordhan. Go straight there, yeah. I don't know if he's the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, but he's clearly one of them. Mr. Gordhan, may I invite you to say a few words?
I landed at OR Tambo Airport, received a message about blue ties and yellow ties. I had a blue tie on. I decided to go home, change to a yellow tie, so that Mr. Maimane doesn't confuse me and Mr. Ramaphosa with his party. I hope you can see the yellow clearly. And then we've had 2 nights, as you might have observed, of I don't know, ask the next guy. I didn't know about that. I wasn't at that meeting. They weren't at my house. That transaction happened when I was sick. You got it? Eh? Now, I thought it would be a little bit more than that, you know. You should compliment the Portfolio Committee, the acting chairperson, and the members across party lines who've been doing great work. So applaud them, ladies and gentlemen. So let me make 4 or 5 quick points, and then let's have a conversation. The first is that we can certainly say that we have a crisis of sorts in South Africa. Secondly, we've analyzed that crisis to death. Thirdly, what's the new things that we can actually do? And fourthly, how do you actually put all of that into motion with the maximum possible unity and consensus amongst everyone concerned? And before I get there, I want to just say that Mr. Ramaphosa's new deal has no similarity with the DA, and I'll explain that in a moment. As far as democracy is concerned, you can see that there are many people in cabinet who have explanations to offer about the email stories that have been revealed, the frequency of travel to Dubai or Switzerland or elsewhere, and their association with clearly people and families and circles and now syndicates who have proven themselves as prime extractors of revenue and wealth from you as South Africans. The second thing about our democracy is that Parliament has been nominally there as a key demonstration that democracy works in South Africa. Over the past few weeks, you've seen Parliament actually coming into its own through various committees, including the Public Enterprises Committee. And I think it has both created a national interest on the one hand, but also a bit of enthusiasm that the people that you pay, which includes me, are at last doing their work and holding people to account and asking them to explain their behavior, their approvals, their associations, and what happens to institutions in their charge and what doesn't happen to them. It's taken a tremendous amount of courage, ladies and gentlemen, for this process to happen. And I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about many people on that committee. And what's good is that we actually have across the party consensus most of the time on how we want to approach issues and what are the issues that we actually want to table. So compliments to all of them. But there's a flip side to this. The flip side is the Hollywood performance that you see. You can choose Nollywood, Bollywood, or Hollywood, right? Straight faces, and as I said last night, it really does remind some of us who've been in detention under the apartheid regime of how we used to behave when we used to be quizzed by the security branch. I don't think too many of you would have had that experience, regrettably. But if you did, you'll understand how this straight-face, nonplussed approach, no shame, no guilt, no nothing, actually comes across. But I'm sure that ultimately, as many of us said last night in the committee, the public is far more intelligent than these people think they are, and they can actually figure out what's really going on. Am I right? Okay. But we're moving into a new phase. And the new phase is a phase of, firstly, there was an attempt to stop this inquiry. Now, there are several attempts to intimidate people. Right? So, some people who come from far-off areas, and I'm talking about facts, I'm not talking about fiction, are having their children harassed at the moment. You've heard about the evidence leader, Advocate Vanara, an absolutely skilled, dignified, knowledgeable gentleman, completely non-aggressive. And like Mr. Jonas, he's offered a bribe, except it wasn't 600 million rands. I wonder what Jimmy Manya had to say about that earlier on. Of course, he'll say it didn't happen. And to have somebody who was appointed to cabinet subsequently to be involved in the process of bribing someone on behalf of a board member of ESCOM, that's what we don't know yet, on behalf of a board member of ESCOM, is quite a tragedy. Then, of course, the fake news channels kick in, maligning different individuals. I seem to be enjoying the privilege of having a lot of attention from them from time to time, attention we can actually do without. So it's in this moment that we hope that the new life that Parliament has and the way in which it is operating is something we continue into the future, so that we have this healthy, constructive tension, not for destructive purposes, to show that our democracy is in fact alive. You well know about our institutions. Prosecuting authority, I think there was a discussion on the Revenue Service earlier on, National Treasury, and of course SASA, the grants agency, and most importantly the state-owned entities, which we've been discussing for the last few weeks. I don't know how the Minister of Finance can say that Michael Sachs merely asked for a transfer, so don't worry. A transfer means that you're leaving the Treasury. A transfer means that the key head of the Budget Office, which is at the center of the budgeting process in South Africa, which the Ministers of Finance eventually deliver on the third week of February each year, after 10 or 15 years of training and experience, is leaving, as are possibly others as well. I would be actually saying, I'm sorry to see him going. I'll make some extraordinary efforts to keep him and ask him what are his concerns, so that we can retain that kind of skill, because you don't build that skill in even 5 years, and the kind of experience that is actually required. So what we see in these institutions, and I don't think I need to convince you of that, is the active collaboration and actual sabotage of key institutions that are here to actually serve us for many generations to come, not just now. And institutions are animals, if you like, that take a long, long time to build. long time to build up the expertise, the experience, undertake the transformation that gives black officials an opportunity to rise, create a non-racial environment and a non-sexist environment in them. It can take 6 months to start destroying them and doing the wrong things. And that, as South Africans, we need to be actually very aware of. The third point is about the economy. I think what you see in what Mr. Ramaphosa delivered as his speech on the New Deal for South Africa is firstly a very frank assessment of where is our economy, whether it's fiscally, in growth terms, in investment terms, in confidence terms, and in terms of the consumer and how they feel about where the economy is going. And whether we like it or not, the reality is people are generally risk averse. No investment is actually going to take place of any serious order until January, February next year. And unless we create the right kind of climate, this economy is not going to grow beyond 1%. And what we actually need is 3 to 5%. But together with that, I think what he was saying in the New Deal is that we need to be frank in our assessment of that problem, be clear that even within the existing ANC policy framework, we need to do things differently. A new style of leadership is required. New plans are required for particular sectors, whether it be agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, or the services area. New ideas need to be generated without which South Africa can't compete, nor can the economy develop new areas in which it will actually provide growth. But above all, what he is saying at a general level is that we require a new leadership. The current leadership in the country has failed us. It has failed us because its preoccupation has been how to fill certain people's bank accounts, either local or foreign. That's the priority. The priority isn't you or the 55 million South Africans who are looking for some growth opportunity, some opportunity to accumulate wealth, assets, not at the top 10% level, but at the bottom 50% level, so that we can say there's a better standard of living that has actually emerged. But for that to be achieved and for the danger of a reversal to be averted, and that's what Mr. Ramaphosa is saying, in addition to the new leadership, what we require is a greater unity of purpose. The experiment that we had in 2016 of bringing labor, business, and government together, and more recently the active role that civil society is playing, is something that must be increased in a formidable way and intensified so that we can combine all of our resources, utilize the full potential that South Africa has, and through that leadership begin to change the economy of South Africa. The key elements of this plan is to take a different approach to the creation of jobs, not use it as slogans, not use it for populist reasons, but put in place programs through this unity of purpose so that 1 million jobs are created in different kinds of contexts, through different initiatives, and through new ways of actually doing things. I know many of you will say, we've heard this before. I've heard it before as well. But having heard it before doesn't mean that we don't have to keep trying, because you and I and many others cannot afford to have 6 million young people walking around the streets of South Africa in either rural, semi-rural, peri-urban, or urban areas without any possibility of a job, without any possibility of a future. So if you want a different South Africa, then we all need to contribute ideas to how we can create just enough jobs so that people can get 1 year's experience, which is what the Youth Employment Service Program is looking at between government and the private sector with the blessings of the trade unions. A new approach needs to be taken to agriculture and land. And here the idea is that we require, if the right things happen in December at the ANC conference, an indaba amongst all the key players, so that in a fundamental way, the issues of land access, land ownership, agricultural productivity, growth of new black farmers is turned into a reality through the cooperative efforts of everyone concerned, and you begin to have a paradigm change in which through which we actually do these things. But all of this is not possible unless we actually create sufficient confidence in the country for people to invest and for growth to happen, but also for that growth to be focused on solving the inequality problem, a problem that is today pervading the whole of the world, not only South Africa. Some of you might know a hedge fund executive or owner who has $150 billion of money under his control called Ray Dalio. Made billions of rands. I think he's the 17th richest man in the world. Published a book recently called Principles and something else. But his main concern, for example, in the US, is that 0.1% of the US population has the equivalent of 90% of the wealth of all other Americans. Right? 0.1% versus the rest. In South Africa, we're not too different. We're not too different. And inequality is not a sustainable aspect of anybody's economy or society to continue. So the challenge for all of us, apart from, either being critical of one thing or another or bashing one thing or another, is to change our mindsets and become active participants in finding solutions, in ensuring that we ourselves undergo a paradigm change, and a paradigm change that ensures that we begin to share, we begin to demonstrate clear solidarity, and above all, that all of these things are actioned in a way in which it's palpable to the 55 million people. But far more serious than that, as part of the growth and change and transformation process leading to inclusive growth, is for all of us acknowledge that 23 years ahead of our democratic change, we in fact have serious structural problems in our society inherited from our past. Whether it's in relation to land, to gender, to the patrimonial relationships we have in our society, to the fact that the vast majority of South Africans have no assets in their name. None whatsoever. It's hard for the middle class that's sitting here to actually envision that. That when you actually have to say, my daughter or my child, I am handing over X to you, the majority hand over poverty to that generation. Now, if you've got any conscience at all, then we've got to start thinking differently about how we all become part of the solution rather than reinforce the problem. So there are other aspects of the New Deal in relation to provisions for a new youth development program, a very different approach to black business development at a small level and in respect of startups, a new deal for workers, because we have this interesting contradiction around the world and here as well. Aggregate demand, any economist will tell you, is crucial for any economy to grow as one aspect of that economy. But you and I and anybody else can only create demand if we have the disposable income to create demand. Am I right? You don't have money, you can't buy. If you can't buy, you can't create demand. So, if we continue to suppress wages and benefits for workers, where on earth is the demand going to come from? Is a logical question. So, we've got to find solutions to those sorts of problems and begin to ask the question, how do we do things differently? Let me end with two things. The first of which is the December conference of the ANC, because you're going to ask about it. And you're going to ask, what do we anticipate actually happening? Well, I think essentially we will have a contest as part of a democratic process. There's an ANC constitution. There are branches within that constitution that play the major role. The majority of branch general meetings have happened. There's still a significant number that still need to take place, as the Secretary General said yesterday. And there's a fair contest going on, and sometimes a little unfair, as we are noticing, for the support of the branches and the delegates that will go to the branches. Secondly, the ANC has actually set up, through the Secretary General, a number of dispute resolution committees for different provinces so that branches that are unhappy or people within those branches that are unhappy for fair reason have their disputes heard and resolved in a particular way. Thirdly, as the Secretary General said yesterday, the conference will happen. But fourthly, there's going to be a keen contest. And the contest should ultimately, in the eyes of the South African public, be based on a key set of principles. And the key set of principles is what kind of leadership do we require in South Africa today? And as I pointed out earlier on, unless we have a leadership that is focused on national interest rather than self-interest, a leadership that has demonstrated integrity versus what we see going on at the moment and what we might not be seeing at the moment as well. Thirdly, both a clear vision, but also the energy and the intent and the urgency to assemble all South Africans into some kind of unity in action that will begin to show that we are going to change the way in which our economy operates, but also the way in which we deal with our structural problems as well. Tomorrow, 2 of the ratings agencies come to the fore and tell us whether they're downgrading us further or not. And then we really enter junk status if they take road A, or they could take road B, which is let's give the December conference a chance. Let's see what kind of political leadership emerges from the December conference. What kind of fiscal outlook do they actually demonstrate? What kind of political stability we demonstrate as a society? And then we will decide what to do in respect of the grading process. So in that sense, and many more senses, this is a critical conference, both for the ANC itself and for the country. And in my own mind, I'm very clear that the kind of New Deal proposition that has nothing to do with the DA, by the way, is something that we give Mr. Ramaphosa and the team that he selects an opportunity to implement. And I can guarantee you that if we get that team going, we will have no worries about downgrades. We will see a change in the growth number. We will see increasing inclusivity over the next 2-3 years and a different kind of optimism in the country. So I'm an optimistic guy by nature, and I hope you share my optimism as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gordhan. Was I the only one who noticed he didn't say who he thought would win?
No, I said it.
So you think Cyril Ramaphosa is going to win?
Well, I didn't say that, but I said I want him to win.
I mean, the big question, of course, is whether the contest is going to be clean, whether they're going to be, I mean, you and and many other people in the ANC are very bullish that the contest will actually happen. You don't see the conference collapsing. But is there scope for some kind of shenanigans that deny the outcome you're looking for?
Well, shenanigans are always possible. The desperate, as you saw over the last few nights in Parliament, will always get up to some shenanigan or the other. The question is whether there's enough resilience in the main body politic of the ANC to be able to resist those shenanigans and make sure that a democratic process actually unfolds.
The inquiry that you're a part of at the moment in Parliament, I mean, it's astonishing evidence that's coming out. Do you think that's having an impact on the politics in the ANC? I mean, time and time again we hear evidence from Zola Tsotsi. We saw what happened last night. Do you think that's affecting how delegates and branches are perhaps thinking?
Well, that's where you and the media come in, amongst others, and that is to translate what is happening in the domain of Parliament for middle class and working class and poor citizens. And to say to them that every time we say that the Gupta's got X deal, for example, a guarantee of 1.6 billion rands, so that they can actually get a loan from a particular bank and then get a further advance of some 600 million rands from Eskom in cash. It's not a guarantee that goes through a particular set of channels so that they can buy Optimum Holdings. No sooner they buy Optimum Holdings, they dispose of the profitable part of Optimum Holdings, i.e. the Richards Bay, or the stake that they have in the Richards Bay coal terminal, and so on and so on and so on. What does that mean? It means that where workers should be benefiting from increased mining, where workers should be benefiting, for example, in the case of Exxaro, from an expansion of their production through the normal investment that Eskom makes in buying land surrounding a particular area where the mining is actually taking place, and would mean extra jobs for people in those areas where jobs are extremely difficult to actually find. That's a consequence of the kind of decisions that executives and board members and higher up are taking about these sorts of things. If you are paying 10 million rands of every 50 million rands for each locomotive that is part of the China South rail deal, all of you are aware of it. Okay?
They read Daily Maverick.
Do they? They're looking very passive at the moment. Wouldn't you like to earn 10 million rand commission for doing nothing? And then the money stays outside. Last night you heard a slight entanglement around Denel. But what was the deal that we were trying to actually, A, get more information on, and B, make sure that the country, forgive the language, doesn't get screwed in the process? The deal was a new entity is created by a partnership between Denel and VR Laser, which is owned largely by Salim Issa, who was called ISUP for some reason last night. There might be a reason for that, but we'll come back to that. And a new entity, Denel Asia, is created. But one of the things that will be taken from Denel is the intellectual property. The second thing that would happen, money earned through these transactions that might follow will be kept outside the country. Is that what you want as South Africans? Or do you want that to come back into the country so that Denel doesn't need any guarantees? They have a guarantee of 1.9 billion rands from the national fiscus at this particular point in time. Go into PRASA, go into Transnet, go into Denel, go into Eskom. Look at the SASA saga. 17 million citizens are waiting for grants to be paid properly. And you get all sorts of dancing happen. But somehow, the minister concerned is able to dance around all of us. Somehow, the highest court in the land and its instructions can be defied. It's a miracle. We are a constitutional democracy. And yet we are all witnesses to this, but we sit and we seem to be powerless. Now, we've got to ask the logical question, what's driving this behavior? So, when we ask for more money for student fees, when we ask for more support for youth development programs, when we ask for more funds to be available to small businesses and micro businesses so that they can start and even fail in certain instances, where we want investment in certain manufacturing areas or technology areas so that we can innovate in areas where our economy would outcompete other African countries for a start, let alone the world, all of that money could come from these resources that are being taken away at the moment. So what the inquiry is actually showing is that ordinary South Africans, particularly disadvantaged South Africans, suffer a great deal without them fully understanding it. But what is happening, and there's no doubt about that, and as people who host talk shows, you should know, is that there's an increasing awareness of what these dynamics are, how they actually connect the dots, so to speak, and what consequences these imply for so-called ordinary South Africans. And that's the good part of our democracy, that people are no longer willing to be bluffed easily. There's a keen interest in what the government and the state and its operatives are actually doing. And I bet, given a chance in 2019, if we don't change the way in which the ANC works and the government works, there'll be dire consequences.
You painted a picture, a fairly rosy picture, if the person you're supporting, I think we can name him, his name's not Voldemort, it's Cyril Ramaphosa, wins. You suggested the economy could turn around quite quickly. What happens if the other candidate wins? It's not a rosy picture, I would imagine.
Well, you don't know who the other candidate is, firstly, so I don't want to talk about other individuals. I want to talk about who is it that actually meets the criteria amongst others that I've actually set out, firstly. Secondly, it changes because one of the things that we've been ignoring for the better part of, the last year or more, is the confidence factor. And confidence is not measurable. You can't take a ruler and measure it, although you have all these indices that pretend to measure it. And confidence is about, do I have trust in this government? If I invest money here, is it safe, and will I get the return that I actually require? If my money is in the bank, and when I want it, can I actually withdraw it? And in that sense, our banks are extremely safe before you get worried and run off. What economists will say is that we're in a vicious cycle at the moment, where everything that's happening is feeding into negativity. One or two decisive actions can start the process of a virtuous cycle. Right? That's how life operates, it would appear, in terms of the behavior of human beings and economies as well. So what is it going to take to move from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle? And what role can we play? And we shouldn't feel disempowered in this process. And if you look at let's reflect, take our minds back to 9/12. Which year am I talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Hey, these guys need food now, I think.
I think they're dehydrated. It's so
They're
hot in here.
dehydrated.
Yeah.
So 2015, when Mr. Nene was dismissed and was supposed to be leaving immediately for a post at the BRICS Bank that didn't exist, and you had the turmoil in the markets, which you would be familiar with, and then we get this 4-day minister, and then you get this, 18-month minister. That comes thereafter. And what that showed was that if you began to do the right things, which we were beginning to do from December 14th until we were dismissed as a team, actually created confidence, created a new sense of unity of purpose between business, labor, and government. Civil society was mobilized as it never was in recent years, with a very decisive purpose, as Sipho Patiana and others might have talked about earlier in the day. And we could engage with investors who have billions of dollars invested in our bond markets, in our equities, and in the real economy. We could engage with the ratings agencies and present a credible picture. And one of the regrettable things is that we told them we will never get to this popular stage, but which we are into at the moment. So watch that carefully. And all that has been lost because we gained a lot of credibility for the country at that time as a team. And you had a unique unity of purpose. And we could have gone places with that because the private sector, white monopoly capital, was willing to come to the party. And I think we could have laid the basis for more fundamental transformation in our economy through the confidence and trust that we were beginning to build at that time. But that didn't matter because it was far more important to make sure that bank accounts remained open where the banks actually doubted their clients. It was far more important to get certain approvals in terms of the PFMA, and it was far more important to get what might be anticipated as difficult people out of the way, and equally important to punish those who refused to take a 600 million rand bribe.
With your permission, I'm going to take one or two questions from the floor. There are T's and C's to these questions, I understand. Who would like to ask a question? If you stick your hand up and maybe just give us a name, and then we'll take a question from there. We've got a person over there. Good afternoon.
Hello.
How's it?
Hi. My name is Hlati Madela. I had a question reserved for Mr. Pravin Gordhan. What I'm going to say here, so that we are not being doubted as if we manufacture things, go to the ESCOM financial statements for anybody here who thinks we are making up things from 2007 up to today. I want to talk about the hollowing out of the ESCOM. My question is that we have two major contracts in this country, Medupi and Kusile. Medupi is 69 billion rand, and that's what it was signed at 2007, 2008. Kusile, 82 billion rand, also signed around about that time. ESCOM and National Treasury said, we do not have a capability and a capacity to project manage and coordinate these huge contracts. The two institutions then hired Britain, PB Power, and America, Black & Veatch, to manage these contracts because the owners of this project do not have the capabilities to project manage them. These contracts continue escalating up to a point where we now today, they are at 438 billion rand. That means 287 billion rand has been hollowed out of the ESCOM balance sheet when ESCOM and National Treasury said, we do not have the capability and the capacity to manage these contracts. And the actual financing of this is money from the export credit agencies. But the National Treasury must sign guarantees.
I'm going to ask you to ask a question,
my question to you quickly. As a former Minister of Finance, why did you keep providing guarantees for something that was clear that it was hollowing out an ESCOM balance sheet? Where was the activism that you now show today? Thank you.
Do you have a response?
Yeah, no, definitely. So firstly, the events that the gentleman mentions are probably true. I don't have any contrary facts. Secondly, the Treasury doesn't hire anybody to build power plants. That's Eskom's job. What the Treasury does is to evaluate Eskom's financials from time to time. Once, maybe in my time, once a year we would get reports from Treasury just before they announce their results, from Eskom rather. So firstly, factually, it's incorrect to say that Eskom and Treasury hired so-and-so. As far as I know, the Treasury is not involved in hiring anybody. Secondly, the escalation in cost is correct, but that you should get the Eskom management and the ministers concerned here and ask them how under their watch did this actually increase. Thirdly, we offer as Treasury, or used to offer, guarantees to many state entities. So SAA to the tune of about 15 billion rands, Denel, as I said, about 1.9, SABC at one stage 1.4, SA Express has about 1 billion rands, but the biggest of this out of the is a facility of 350 billion rands. In other words, Eskom could use the sovereign as a guarantor to borrow up to 350 billion rands. Until recently, they had borrowed just below 200 billion rands. And it's a guarantee that government decides upon and agrees upon, so that in most things in life, as you know, you want to build a house, most people go and borrow money to build a house. Most people borrow money to buy a car. Most people borrow money to invest in a particular asset. And the people that you are borrowing the money from will want to assess you in terms of your credit risk. If you are a risk, you won't get the money, and sometimes they overdo it. If they don't see you as a risk, and if you have the right collateral, you will very easily get the money. But that's at a private citizen level. The expectation in the case of Eskom is that it's going to be well managed. And it took a bit of time to begin to find out why boards were changed in 2011, then again, I think in 2015 or 2016, why there has been a revolving door as far as CEOs and CFOs are actually concerned. Then you have this problem of load shedding, and a guy who has actually, that's a question I forgot to ask last night, no experience in turning around anything actually, Mr. Molefe. He worked in the Treasury, he worked in the PIC, did a reasonably decent job. He's a very astute gentleman. Worked in Transnet, which was already stable, so that's not turning around anything. And then comes to Eskom and provides you with the guarantee that you'll have electricity in the form that load shedding wouldn't actually happen. But if you speak to Mr. Matona, and the previous CEO, who was mysteriously suspended, and that's what you heard from Mr. Sotsi's evidence yesterday, he will say that in his couple of months at Eskom, he stabilized the situation, he built up a team, he worked out a plan, and all that happened after his suspension and eventual departure is that the plan was actually implemented. So to get to your point, the Treasury is not complicit in anything as far as I'm concerned. The people that you should really have here, as we had last night, are both the political office bearers and the boards who were responsible at the time. And each time, by the way, that we give guarantees or permission to borrow against the guarantee, if the Treasury officials were here, they will tell you there are a long list of conditions, whether it's SAA or anybody else. But what I do want to concede is that the political environment in which all of this happens is a difficult one. That, for example, SAA wouldn't be in the position where these large bailouts and so on were necessary in the recent months if there was just the will to change a couple of members of its board, including its chairperson, a year ago. That's all. It needed one change so that you will have stability there, appoint a credible CEO like you have now, get a proper CFO, and run the operations properly. So the hollowing out, if you like to use that term, is a self-inflicted injury, but it's a self-inflicted injury that you and I have to take responsibility for as taxpayers. That's why the inquiry is so important, so that we can get the facts to the public and make it happen. Possibly you can say, were you as vigilant as you should be? Perhaps not, because you trust people. And then when the trust is actually betrayed, it's a bit too late to do something about some of these elements.
So I would love to offer more questions, but there are people who are bigger than me who are telling me that we need to move on.
Let's take two. Let's be democratic.
Good morning. I'm here. I'm saying good morning because you slept at 2 o'clock this morning, and it really was an emotionally hyped session, so thank you for being here. I've got two questions, and they're very interlinked. We often hear that democratic centralism is one of the barriers to dealing with issues of accountability in the ANC. And it comes up a lot. It comes from the branches, it comes from the process of electing leaders, and so on and so on. As the leadership, what is it that what's your view, and what is it that needs to be done to actually change that perspective? Because if we can't trust that, we can't trust all the process. The link to that, Ace Mahashula earlier this year actually did say one of the issues that we'll deal with, all of the shenanigans that we're dealing with, is dealing with that system. So I really would like to hear your thought. And lastly, and very importantly, we are struggling with the fact that each time we talk about accountability, we talk about accountability when the mess is so high. I mean, it's a messy situation, and then people become accountable. What is it that you guys and the leadership are doing to actually groom leadership from the branches to deal with issues of teaching them about what good leadership is and what it is to serve the youth of South Africa and the citizens of South Africa?
Thank you.
Now, as you say, the two questions are linked. Democratic centralism in the current era is a mistaken notion, because that was the practice of the Bolshevik Party in underground conditions. That was the practice of the ANC and South African Communist Party when they were in fact banned, and a variety of that gets extended, not only in the ANC, by the way, in other organizations as well, including ones that claim to be democratic in their name. So that's the first thing. The second is that what you do require, watch what happens to events that take place in that party. There's tougher centralism than in the ANC, by the way. Think about it. The second point, where you're absolutely right, is that we need to generate a new form of democracy. A democracy where there is discipline, where there are clear paradigms and policy frameworks within which we work, but there's also room for dissent, for different views, for diversity, and proper engagement at a completely different level outside of sloganeering. Sloganeering is one of the big diseases in politics because it hides a whole lot of things that most ordinary people can't actually fathom. So take out the slogans and ask ourselves in simple terms, what's the problem we're actually dealing with? The third point about accountability, there are lots of lessons to learn. You're absolutely right. So you've had Parliament for 23 years, but there's interesting experiments happening at the moment. And thanks to brave people in certain quarters, this inquiry, for example, has continued, and there's new life in many of the committees as well. But there are also forces who are trying to dull that life and take it back to one where democratic centralism of the wrong kind will dampen the spirit of accountability as well. So for the new generation of leaders, let's define democracy in a proper way. Democracy means that you might be elected as a leader, but you have closed ears, you're a danger to society. Democracy means that if you think you know it all, you're a danger to society, because there's no human being on earth that knows it all. Thirdly, if democracy means that you refuse to listen to good advice, but make sure you have a diversity of advice in your presence, and then apply your judgment, then equally democracy dies as well. And fourthly, if you're not afraid from time to time of being asked the question, why did you do this? Because that's what accountability is about, then you're not democratic. Because that element of apprehension has to be there, that I've got to explain to somebody why and how certain things actually happen. So I hope that the younger generations will actually begin to cultivate a new style of democracy and give democracy a new content. Because as you can see, both around the world, which is regressing in terms of democracy, and in the neighborhood, the fascinating things that are actually happening. But the truth of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's this thing I read recently which says that those who have lots of money and gain power from the ownership of money can access political power and control or manage or instruct political power. And once they do that, they actually accumulate more money as well. And that's the vicious circle that we as citizens of South Africa have to avoid and begin to enrich our democracy in an appropriate way.
Do you think you'll be able to answer a question in 30 seconds?
Yeah, let's try.
If we gave one person an opportunity, and it's got to be literally a 13-second question. Yes, sir, go for it.
Thank you so much. I'm Azwi. I'm from the Mighty Economic Freedom Fighters. You know as much as I do that renegades are seldom the best advocates of the cause in which you have deserted as a former communist. In any case, your neoclassical economic analysis, together with Ramaphosa, is devoid of the fact that the thesis in this country is that the factors of production, distribution, and exchange are still in the hands of few who happens to be white. And coupled to that is your clopatic state, which is represented by your own organization, which ANC. And there can be only one antithesis. And that antithesis is the socialization of means of production, distribution, and exchange as enshrined in the 7 non-negotiable pillars of the economic freedom fighters, in order to usher in a synthesis which is an egalitarian society. I pause.
So, from the lessons that I learned in the 1970s, the one thing that's missing in your equation is the means of production, so you might want to include that. Secondly, the dialectic is absolutely correct, thesis, antithesis, and new synthesis. And society, through the contradictions that are developing and maturing over time, will continue to provide new syntheses of different kinds. The only question is whether the contradictions are going through quantitative change or qualitative change. And if they're just quantitative changes, they don't actually mean anything because they're precisely that. They're incremental changes. From time to time, societies confront a set of contradictions that have ripened to the point where qualitative change happens. We saw that, in a sense, at the political level in 1994. So thanks for outlining the manifesto of the EFF. It's good to hear that. And some other time we can debate the rest. Thank you very much.
Pravin Gordhan, ladies and gentlemen.